So just a little introduction. In the United States right now, interest in college football is at an all-time high. Viewership on television, college football is breaking records all the time. 2 years ago, the college football playoff was introduced, and the national championship game that year broke all kinds of records, set the all-time viewership record for cable programming. However, while interest in college football is at an all-time high, actual attendance at live college football games has been steadily declining for several years. Matter of fact, in 2014, average home attendance at FBS college football games in the United States, that's Football Bowl subdivision, that's the highest level of college football there, decreased to its lowest average in 14 years. So why is this important? Well, obviously, less fans attending the game means the gate receipts are going to be lower. Also, the opportunity to sell merchandise, concessions, and things at the stadium itself are impacted when you have less fans at the game. Can also impact other revenue drivers like sponsorship and even media rights agreements. Okay, so researchers in sport management, they've been researching the factors that influence game attendance for quite some time now. And while most of these studies have focused on motivation, more recently researchers have looked at constraint factors. So while motivation or motives can be seen as positively influencing attendance, constraints can be considered barriers to attendance. And in these previous studies, researchers have used different models to test these relationships. And although motives and constraints were found to be correlated with game attendance, we're still a little bit unclear on why some fans or some individuals, some people are able to overcome these constraints while others can't. So in 2011, following Trail and Kim's study that looked at constraint factors influencing attendance at women's college basketball games, they encouraged further research to look at potential moderating factors that might influence these relationships. So for our study here, we're introducing strength and motivation, an individual strength and motivation to attend the game as a potential moderating variable in the relationship between individual constraint factors and attendance. So for this study, we actually performed two different data collections, one following the 2013 season, one following the 2014 season. And we began by performing these one-on-one interviews to try and identify what the common constraint factors were. So we had two objectives for this first data collection. Was one, to identify these common constraint factors, and then second was to examine strength and motivation as a possible moderating variable. For our theoretical framework, we used the balanced proposition, which is taken from leisure constraints theory, simply stated that participation in a leisure activity depends on the interaction between constraints and a person's motivation to participate in that activity. Okay, so I mentioned at the beginning about declining overall attendance at college football games, but student attendance has also been declining for some time, even at the big-time, the schools that have big-time football programs. So for those of you that don't know, I mentioned the FBS level being the highest level of college football in the United States, but within that group there's what's called the Power 5 conferences, and these are the elite programs. So even there, the students that attend these schools have been attendance has been decreasing. And why that's important is, well, students today, they're the future donors, season ticket holders, and supporters of the program. So our target sample was these full-time students at a Power 5 football school. And prior to our survey, as I said, we conducted these one-on-one interviews, and as a result of them and our literature review, we came up with actually 7 constraints I'll talk about here in a moment, but from there, we've created these 25 items and administered our survey, of which we received 208 completed responses. So we have 3 variables. We're measuring constraints, strength and motivation, and then attendance intentions is our outcome variable. And for our data analysis, we performed CFA, confirmatory factor analysis, to check our psychometric properties before using SEM to look at these relationships. Okay, so these are the factors that we identified through these interviews and also a review of the literature. So the individuals that we surveyed indicated that they felt constrained by time or other commitments, not having somebody to attend games with, early kickoff or start times, weather, opponent quality, preference for watching on TV, and cost. And you'll see there's 2 asterisks here. So early start time and opponent quality, those had never been measured previously as constraint dimensions. So we identified those and measured them in our survey along with the others. Okay, so here we see the results of our CFA. Our fit indices indicate here that we have a reasonable model fit. And you can see, other than the time constraint, which we had some problems, and I'll talk a little bit about that as we go through here, our factor loadings are all significant, indicating good convergent validity. Also, the squared correlations of our latent variables, none of those were above their respective AV scores, so indicating we have good discriminant validity here. We used Cronbach's alpha, composite reliability, and our AV scores to check for reliability. Okay. Now, prior to performing our SEM, we divided our sample into a high motivation group and a low motivation group in order to test strength and motivation as a moderating variable using the k-means clustering to do so. So we have 108 in our high group and 98 in our low group. And what we're seeing here is just the significant relationships that we saw from our SEM. So those individuals that were highly motivated to attend games, there was a significant and negative relationship between time and attendance intentions. And then the relationship of opponent quality was also significant. However, you see that it's positive here. And then the low group also had 2 that were significant. They were different. Preference for watching games on TV was significant and negatively associated with attendance intentions, while weather was significant and positive. And as I mentioned, the time constraint exhibited low reliability and factor loading score. We account for that in our second data collection. I'll share a little bit more about that when we go forward. So just in summary, from our first study here, we identified 7 common constraint factors, including 2 new ones that had not been measured previously. And so one thing I didn't mention here is when we performed, in order to check for strength and motivation as a moderating variable, we had to first perform our metric invariance and confirm that before doing our chi-square difference test, which showed us that actually there was a difference in these relationships between the high group and the low group. I'll mention as we go forward. So what I'm saying here is strength and motivation, what we found is it does play a moderating role in the relationship between these individual constraint factors and attendance intentions. In other words, depending upon how motivated someone is to attend, then how they perceive or respond to these constraints, we found there was a difference. And though most constraints were negatively associated with attendance, we just looked at the ones that were significant. The ones that we didn't show, most of those were negative, but we did see some were positively associated with attendance intentions. Although this isn't a new phenomenon in constraints studies, we felt this might indicate the presence of another mechanism that might enable highly motivated fans to more successfully negotiate constraints. And we believe that that mechanism is negotiation. So why negotiation? If we look back at some of the leisure studies, they've shown that negotiation has an ability to counteract the negative effect of constraint factors. So we wanted to perform a second data collection, introduce negotiation as a mediating variable between these 7 constraint factors and attendance intentions, and see once again if strength and motivation would still, the moderation would still hold. So our sample, there was a new data collection, but still the same target sample. We received 320 completed responses. And we created 4 items to measure negotiation. And then we also improved the wording for our time constraints. So in the first study, we really when we measured time, we measured it as a multidimensional construct. In other words, we asked people on the survey, you wanted to attend a game, but you could not because you were constrained by family obligations or social or work, I think is what we did. So we made it more of a unidimensional construct here, like I wanted to attend, but I couldn't because I was too busy with other things, or so forth. And our psychometric properties were much better. So Okay, so introducing negotiation as a mediating variable. We performed another test for moderation. We found that strength and motivation still moderated this relationship between now the individual constraint factors in negotiation. And we actually had 3 significant relationships for the high motivation group. So once again, time was found to be negatively significant and negatively associated with attendance intentions. This preference for watching games on TV also had a negative relationship. And then we have weather that still is positive there. We'll talk about that in a second. But we had this mediating variable negotiation, so we're able to test that path coefficient between negotiation and attendance intentions was significant and positive, providing further support for our hypothesis here that these highly motivated individuals are successfully negotiating these constraints. So if they felt constrained by time obligations, or if the weather was hot or cold, or if the game was on TV, what we're seeing here, if they're highly motivated to attend the game, then they're more likely to negotiate or overcome these constraints. And so in our second study, the low motivation group, there were 2 significant relationships. Early start time and opponent quality were significant. And then once again, just like with the high motivation group, our path coefficient between negotiation and attendance intentions gave us further evidence that we feel these folks here are negotiating and overcoming these constraints. And our factor loadings and reliability scores improved significantly for the time constraint. So just a summary from study 2. Once we added negotiation as a mediating variable, we still found that strength and motivation to attend these games moderated that relationship. In other words, the high and low motivation groups, they behave differently, as we just saw. And individual constraint factors were negotiated differently depending upon a respondent's level of motivation to attend the home football games. Okay, so just general discussion overall. Remember in the beginning I mentioned it was Trail and Kim 2011 encouraged further research to look at potential moderating variables. We identified that the strength and motivation that an individual has to attend a game, it influences how they respond to these different constraint factors. We feel this provides a better understanding, hopefully, of how constraint factors influence the spectator decision-making process. And remember, we identified 7 constraint factors, 2 of which had not been measured before prior to our study: early start time and opponent quality. Okay, and so limitations and directions for future studies. So I think we should use caution here before generalizing these results to broader populations of sports fans. I mentioned the students attending a Power 5 school here. That was our target sample, very specific. Also worth mentioning is the team performance. So we kind of grade them moderate to above average. So the team did not win their conference or even their division, but they had a winning record. They went to a postseason bowl game both years, won the game one year. But the reason why we're bringing this up here is, it's possible that if we looked at a sample at a school where they had less success or maybe even more success, possibly we might see some differences in our outcome. So directions for future studies. Well, another key demographic for athletic programs is their donors and financial supporters of the program. So we could possibly apply this model there to look and see how they deal with constraints when it comes to game attendance, or even how constraints might influence a fan's decision to become a donor. Thank you. And we also feel, where we're at as far as researching constraints, further qualitative research to identify additional constraint factors or other things that are going on here would be a worthwhile endeavor as well.